Last week in Dushanbe, President Ilham Aliyev of Azerbaijan and President Vladimir Putin of Russia held one of the most closely watched bilateral meetings of the year. It came at a time of serious tension, following the tragic downing of an Azerbaijani plane in Russian airspace on December 25th last year. The incident had cast a deep shadow over relations, sparking diplomatic coldness, media restrictions, and rising mistrust between Baku and Moscow. For months, speculation grew about whether the two sides could overcome the rift. Then came Dushanbe, a meeting that many observers now describe as a turning point. According to reports, Vladimir Putin personally briefed Ilham Aliyev on the final results of the investigation, acknowledging that the plane was struck by Russian air defense systems due to a technical malfunction. President Aliyev, in turn, welcomed Russia's transparency and commitment to compensation, a gesture that signaled the beginning of reconciliation. But beyond the incident itself, this meeting was about something larger: the future of Azerbaijani-Russian cooperation. Both countries are central players in the North-South international transport corridor, and their coordination affects regional stability, trade, and even the balance of power across the South Caucasus. So, what does this meeting mean in practical and political terms? Was this a real reset, or just a symbolic handshake? And how might this shift affect regional actors, including Armenia's revanchist circles, who had hoped to benefit from the temporary chill between Moscow and Baku? To explore these questions, several experts shared their perspectives. Geopolitical analyst Irina Tsukerman, president of Scarab Rising Inc., believes the Dushanbe meeting represents not just diplomacy, but strategic recalibration. She notes that the meeting symbolizes not only a handshake after the December 25th horror, but a critical realignment of two intersecting power agendas. Tsukerman emphasizes that both leaders chose pragmatism over speculation or third-party manipulation, particularly from Baku's standpoint.
The Dushanbe meeting between President Ilham Aliyev and President Vladimir Putin represents not only a symbolic handshake after the December 25th horror, but a critical recalibration of two intersecting power agendas. The downing of the Azerbaijani aircraft in Russian airspace, which killed Azerbaijani personnel and shocked many people around the world, has introduced an uncharacteristic chill into what had previously been a relationship of measured pragmatism. By meeting in Dushanbe, both leaders chose to operationalize reconciliation rather than allowing emotion, speculation, or third-party manipulation to dictate the course of their diplomacy, at least from Baku's perspective. This act of engagement, conducted without dramatic preconditions, marked a deliberate attempt to draw a line under the incident and reaffirm the principle that strategic continuity outweighs tactical grievance. However, we should also remark that this incident took place this meeting took place because Azerbaijan has been operating from and negotiating from a position of strength. Baku has refused to take anything but a clear indication of from Moscow that they take full responsibility for the incident. It has refused to allow the Kremlin to dismiss or somehow place blame elsewhere for this for this horrible tragedy. And it's only because President Aliyev has taken that position that the results worked out the way they did. Speaking of the results, the direct result of the meeting was a reactivation of communication channels that had fallen silent in the weeks following the downing of the airplane. In practice, this meant restoring senior-level defense and aviation contacts, as well as instructing respective ministries to resume coordination on energy, customs, and transit issues that had been suspended informally while political atmospherics remained tense. The aviation and military protocols under discussion understood to involve technical arrangements to prevent future incidents, structured flight notification regimes, clear identification procedures for military aircraft, and a reinforced bilateral monitoring team capable of quickly resolving cross-border airspace ambiguities. These mechanisms will not erase the emotional damage, caused by the downing of the plane, but they provide an institutional guarantee that similar errors will not metastasize into strategic crisis in the future. At the political level, Dushanbe was also about optics and posture. Aliyev and Putin sought to demonstrate that they could meet on equal footing and speak as counterparts, managing shared regional responsibilities. Both leaders are aware that their dialogue is closely watched, not only by Armenia, but also by Turkey, Iran, and Western capitals, eager to gauge the degree of Russian influence in the South Caucasus. By holding the meeting on the sidelines of a multilateral summit rather than through a bilateral state visit, they avoided the appearance of either capitulation or excessive ceremony, while reaffirming that their communication remained steady even in difficult circumstances. This format gave both men space to appear pragmatic before domestic audiences. Aliyev is the leader who keeps Azerbaijani interests above emotional impulse, and Putin as the statesman capable of managing delicate relationships amid global isolation. The broader context reveals that both sides had strong incentives to thaw relations. For Azerbaijan, Russia remains an indispensable factor in maintaining balance across the post-war landscape of the Caucasus and a trade partner. Nevertheless, the fact that Azerbaijan held out for this admission of accountability from Russia indicates that Azerbaijan's international position is growing just as Russia's influence is diminishing. Therefore, while Russia still remains an important economic and political factor in Baku's calculus, Baku can now afford to negotiate from a position of strength, and we are seeing that the positions are shifting. Azerbaijan is becoming more internationally integrated, more indispensable as an economic factor and an energy provider in Europe and in the West in general. It's growing closer to the United States in terms of the recent peace agreement negotiations. Russia, on the other hand, is losing prestige and needs Azerbaijan to maintain economic viability as the squeeze from the war in Ukraine and other factors is becoming increasingly visible to the rest of the world. Moscow's peacekeeping presence that is obviously diminishing in importance as the peace talks with Armenia are progressing towards their natural conclusion. Its control over key transport nodes and its historical leverage over Yerevan mean that the total disengagement would be strategically unwise because still Russia remains at least an economic player with Armenia for the time being. For Russia, Azerbaijan's energy, logistics, and regional diplomacy provide a vital link between Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East at a time when Moscow's access to Western markets is curtailed. The two leaders understand that their national interests converge on some of these points, even if they are actually presume largely divergent long-term political strategies. Particularly, this convergence is in maintaining stability along transport corridors, managing Caspian resources, and countering unpredictable shifts in Armenia's domestic politics. Economically, Dushanbe sets the tone for normalization in fields where cooperation had been interrupted but not yet derailed. The restoration of technical discussions on the North-South corridor, Caspian port integration, and customs harmonization is expected to accelerate now that political trust has been at least partially restored. Russian investment groups had delayed certain logistics projects due to uncertainty over political risk. The meeting provided an implicit green light to resume them. For Azerbaijan, the survival of cooperation serves a double purpose. It sustains trade while reinforcing its geopolitical identity as a bridge between regions rather than as a dependent ally. Baku gains from Russia's return to the table because predictability in Moscow's approach translates into strategic leverage for Azerbaijan across multiple fronts. The meeting's regional implications are equally significant. Armenian revanchist factions, particularly those seeking to exploit Russia's isolation to realign Yerevan towards the West, had had wagered that Moscow's rift with Baku could be instrumentalized to rebuild political capital at home. Their calculation rested on the assumption that any cooling between Russia and Azerbaijan would push Moscow to re-embrace Armenia as a loyal client. Dushanbe rendered that assumption obsolete. The visual of Putin and Aliyev engaging cordially, coupled with their affirmation of the spirit of alliance, demonstrated that Russia is unwilling to sacrifice its relationship with Azerbaijan for sentimental or historical reasons. That realization strikes a blow to Armenia's hardline elements who had hoped to recast Russia's role in the region to their advantage. In fact, doing so for Russia, essentially trying to co-opt Armenia, is becoming harder by each day. It still has economic levers, but they're becoming harder and harder to hold as the Pashinyan government moves towards the West and is also cracking down on some of the oligarchs fueling those political elements internally. Indeed, the Armenian political class now faces a strategic paradox. Moscow no longer views Yerevan as its sole regional partner, and the Dushanbe meeting reasserted Azerbaijan's position as an indispensable interlocutor for the Kremlin in any regional configuration, in part, of course, due to its geographical position and in part due to geopolitical elements, including, of course, energy and the fact that Baku is becoming indispensable in energy security in the West. By reaffirming channels of dialogues, Aliyev effectively secured Baku's seat at the table in every negotiation concerning the Caucasus. The result is a subtle but clear message to Armenian revanchists. Attempts to exploit temporary friction between Russia and Azerbaijan will backfire, reinforcing Moscow's awareness that its long-term interests align more closely with Baku's disciplined pragmatism than with Yerevan's erratic political cycles, even if Russia is part of fueling those cycles. At the end of the day, Azerbaijan is simply a stronger country. It is also important to recognize that the Dushanbe meeting represents more than an act of crisis management. It marks a shift in tone that could influence the architecture of post-war governance across the region. If the previous months were defined by mutual suspicion, the months following Dushanbe could focus on structured cooperation in trade, energy, and security, all underpinned by shared aversion to instability. Essentially, Russia can no longer afford having too much instability on multiple fronts. It's facing significant obstacles in Ukraine, significant economic pressure over energy internally, and it is looking to regain its footing in the South Caucasus. This evolution will not occur automatically, however. It will require the depolitization of sensitive issues, greater transparency in incident reporting, and sustained confidence building at both governmental and military levels. But the willingness to return to the principle of predictable dialogue is already a significant accomplishment. For Azerbaijan, this meeting validated the doctrine of strategic balance that Aliyev had championed for years. The president demonstrated that Baku can maintain its special relationship with Ankara while engaging constructively with Moscow. In an era where middle powers often find themselves compelled to choose between larger blocs, Azerbaijan's multi-vector diplomacy remains a model of precision. Its success in managing crisis without alienating key partners enhances its international reputation as a state capable of maneuvering between competing power centers with credibility and restraint. Russia, for its part, used Dushanbe to convey that despite global pressure, it retains influence and inflexibility in its near abroad. Russia's message was mostly to its own domestic audiences and smaller states where it maintains significant influence. By reconciling with Azerbaijan, Moscow not only avoided the risk of isolation in the Caucasus but also reminded other regional actors that it remains capable of shaping outcomes without resorting to coercion. The Kremlin's endorsement of dialogue in the spirit of alliance was not sentimental rhetoric. It was a recognition that transactional partnerships built on reliability have become Moscow's remaining tools for influence. Baku, in this sense, becomes a valuable counterbalance to Russian overdependence on other volatile partners. Whether Dushanbe heralds A new stage in bilateral relations depends on the institutional follow-through. A genuine new stage would entail not just crisis prevention, but joint strategic planning on transit integration, coordinated messaging on regional security, and greater coordination within multilateral forums such as the Caspian Summit or the Non-Aligned Movement. The political atmosphere now permits that possibility, but it will require sustained effort to turn words into practice. If the two sides consolidate this renewed trust into policy mechanisms and project-based collaboration, the December situation may ultimately serve as the event that deepened rather than destroyed bilateral resilience. That said, what happened with the airplane was not the only issue that drove the cooling in relations. There are more strategic concerns that remain at the top of the agenda, and that will be more difficult to overcome than a mere handshake, acknowledgement of accountability, and an apology. Baku is well aware of it, but it will try to balance its relations with Kremlin not so much out of any desire to fully reintegrate with Russia economically and politically, but to maintain stability in the region and predictability in developing relations as other issues currently take priority, and that of course includes the conclusion of the peace agreement with Armenia. The real test at the end of the day will be time. If the momentum from Dushanbe endures, Azerbaijan and Russia may reemerge as pragmatic partners navigating a turbulent regional environment. If it fades, both sides risk slipping back into suspicion and reactive diplomacy. For now, however, the meeting stands as a signal of stability. A reminder that even in moments of profound mistrust, disciplined leadership and geopolitical clarity can restore balance in one of the most strategically sensitive crossroads of Eurasia.
Ilyas Huseynov, on the other hand, a senior advisor at Azerbaijan's Center for Social Research, views the meeting as a crucial opportunity to normalize relations and restore political dialogue. He notes that, while questions remained about the plane crash, cooperation in the economic sphere never stopped.
Rusiya ilə Azərbaycan arasında yaranmış gərgin münasibətlər fonunda Azərbaycan Respublikasının prezidenti cənab İlham Aliyev və Rusiya Federasiyasının prezidenti Vladimir Putin arasında görüşün baş tutması münasibətlərin normallaşması üçün fürsətlər yaradır və baxmayaraq ki, bir sıra suallar, anlaşılmaz məqamlar mövcud idi, iqtisadi sahədə əməkdaşlıq genişlənir, inkişaf edirdi və bu statistik nəticələrdə də özünü göstərir və bu bir sıra açıq qalan sualların həll edilməsi istiqamətində atılan mühüm təməllər belə bir ümid formalaşır ki, Bakı ilə Moskva arasında münasibətlər normallaşacaq və inkişaf mərhələsinə qədəm qoyacaq. 2022-ci ilin 22 fevral tarixində imzalanmış müttəfiqlik qarşılıqlı fəaliyyəti haqqında bəyannamənin ruhuna, prinsiplərinə, istiqamətlərinə uyğun olaraq münasibətlərin inkişafı gözlənilir. Azərbaycan heç vaxt Rusiyaya qarşı münasibətlərin korlanmasında maraqlı olmamışdır. Lakin təyyarə qəzası ilə bağlı çoxsaylı suallar mövcud idi və istintaqın yekunlaşmasına az qalmış Düşənbədə görüşün baş tutması münasibətlərin inkişafı üçün impuls yaradır və hesab edirəm ki, hər iki lider arasında tete-a-tete keçirilmiş görüş bir sıra məsələlərin həllinə təkan verir.
And finally, Irish historian and political analyst Patrick Walsh interprets the meeting as a tangible step toward rapprochement. He highlights that President Putin offered a more substantial apology, acknowledging responsibility for the plane tragedy and promising compensation, a move that helped clear the path for renewed dialogue.
The Dushanbe meeting between Putin and President Aliyev certainly signaled a rapprochement on relations between Azerbaijan and Russia after the deterioration of relations following the tragedy, the Azal tragedy. Essentially, Vladimir Putin, President Putin, promised compensation to the victims and other forms of compensation, plus gave a more substantial apology than he had previously made, basically admitting that Russian air defense had been responsible for the downing of the Azal airliner and the tragedy that followed. The event itself is in some way connected to the introduction into the US Congress of the US Peace Act, the so-called Peace Act, which is really something driven by the Armenian diaspora, which seeks to bring in US sanctions against Azerbaijan in the event of aggression against Armenia. Of course, this aggression is defined as undermining of Armenia's sovereignty or independence and is open to the interpretation of the US president. But it's a dangerous development because essentially a future president, not necessarily Donald Trump, maybe a Democrat, pro-Armenian president, could use it against Azerbaijan to attack the Azerbaijani economy, the oil and gas economy, the energy economy, which is vital to Azerbaijan's stability and its economic interests. So I think in some ways these events are connected because Azerbaijan found itself in a position in which the old balanced foreign policy was of great use. And estrangement of relations with Russia were actually putting Azerbaijan in a position whereby they were prone to US action without any form of security, without any form of insurance in the background. I think, the Peace Act, if it is implemented, might well propel Azerbaijan more into a Eurasian direction with closer relations to China and with improved relations with Russia, because the Peace Act is a very poor piece of foreign policy by the US Congress, and unfortunately it reminds us of the negative effects that the Armenian diaspora has in the West and its continued influence, which is detrimental to the peace process and essentially it has produced a situation in which the US interest has been negated by the Armenians in America by bringing Azerbaijan and Russia closer together and back together. So they've managed to actually go against the US interest overall.